A respected judge delivers a 60-year sentence to a young man he believes is guilty. But when a forgotten piece of evidence resurfaces, it uncovers a web of corruption so deep it shakes the justice system to its core. The courtroom was packed that day in Los Angeles, California. The air was thick with tension, not just from the summer heat, but from the weight of the decision about to be made. All eyes were fixed on Judge Robert Carter, a man whose reputation preceded him. He wasn't known for leniency or second chances. His rulings were swift, firm, and unyielding. At 62, with 35 years on the bench, his face had become as hardened as his judgments, a testament to the many lives he had altered with a single strike of his gavel. The defendant, 24-year-old Evan Davis, stood at the defense table, his hands trembling slightly but his gaze unwavering. He wore the kind of expression that came from a lifetime of fighting to prove his worth. Evan had always maintained his innocence, even during his arrest for the armed robbery of a jewelry store that had left one man critically wounded. But today, his voice would not matter. Mr. Davis, Judge Carter began, his deep voice filling the room. You stand convicted by a jury of your peers for crimes that have caused irreparable harm to this community. Your actions were not just reckless but calculated, and you have shown no remorse. Evan's mother, seated in the back row, stifled a sob. She had begged the court to see him as more than a mere case number, to remember the boy she had raised, the boy who once dreamed of becoming a firefighter. But the evidence had spoken louder. Eyewitness testimonies, surveillance footage, and an anonymous tip had sealed his fate. I hereby sentence you to 60 years in state prison, Judge Carter declared, his gavel striking the oak block. The sound reverberated, final and absolute. Evan stood motionless, his lips pressed into a thin line, as if holding back words he knew would never change anything. The room erupted in gasps, whispers, and the shuffle of reporters scribbling notes. But for Evan, the world had gone silent. He turned to look at his mother one last time before being led away, his shackled footsteps fading into the hall. Judge Carter returned to his chambers, closing the door against the noise. He poured himself a cup of black coffee, staring into the swirling liquid, as though it held the answers he sought. The day had been long, but justice, as he saw it, had been served, or so he thought. Little did he know, the truth he had just buried would soon claw its way to the surface, refusing to stay hidden. The trial had been one for the books. Local news outlets dubbed it the Davis robbery case, and it dominated the headlines for weeks. The crime itself had been a spectacle. A masked gunman storming into Lincoln's Jewelers in downtown Fresno on a busy Thursday afternoon, brandishing a weapon and making off with over $150,000 in stolen goods. The chaos left one store clerk, Patrick Foster, fighting for his life after being struck in a crossfire. Evan Davis, a part-time mechanic with no prior criminal record, had been arrested 2 weeks after the robbery. An anonymous caller tipped off authorities, claiming Evan fit the description of the suspect seen fleeing the scene. The prosecution painted a damning picture, connecting him to the stolen goods recovered from a storage unit registered under his name. Evan's court-appointed defense attorney struggled to make headway against a mountain of evidence. There was a grainy surveillance footage showing a man with a similar build and gait, eyewitnesses who swore they recognized Evan's voice, and perhaps most incriminating of all, fingerprints found on the weapon left behind at the scene. Still, Evan maintained his innocence. I didn't do this, he told the jury during his testimony. I wasn't anywhere near that store. I've never even touched a gun. His alibi, he claimed he was working a double shift at the auto shop that day, crumbled under scrutiny when his boss admitted on the stand that he couldn't verify Evan's whereabouts for the full day. The prosecution's closing arguments were as sharp as they were unforgiving. This is a man who thought he could outsmart the law, the district attorney declared, pacing before the jury. But the evidence doesn't lie. The fingerprints don't lie. The witnesses don't lie. In contrast, Evan's defense felt feeble, almost defeated. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, his lawyer pleaded, there are holes in this case. Doubts. Isn't that enough to give this young man the benefit of the doubt? But his voice lacked conviction, and the jury wasn't swayed. Deliberation was swift, less than 3 hours. The verdict, guilty on all counts. Evan didn't flinch as the foreperson read the decision, But the tightening of his jaw betrayed the storm brewing inside him. Judge Carter, impartial as ever, prepared himself to deliver a sentence he felt was justified. He had seen hardened criminals in his courtroom, men who had mastered the art of manipulation. To him, Evan was no different. His gaze swept the courtroom before landing on Evan, as if searching for any sign of remorse or redemption. When the sentence was handed down, it was as though the room itself exhaled. For the victims and their families, there was relief. For Evan and his mother, devastation. The system had spoken, and it was unforgiving. But as Judge Carter signed the sentencing papers later that evening, a faint flicker of something unsettled him, a nagging sense he couldn't quite place. He dismissed it, chalking it up to fatigue. What Judge Carter couldn't know was that the trial had been just the beginning. The real story was waiting for him, hidden in plain sight, and it was about to change everything. It started on an unremarkable Wednesday evening. Judge Carter sat in his study, the warm glow of a desk lamp illuminating the cluttered stacks of legal briefs and case files. Retirement had been on his mind lately, but tonight there was work to be done. A new case involving police misconduct had landed on his desk, and the allegations were serious enough to warrant extra attention. As he thumbed through the documents, something caught his eye, an evidence log from a prior investigation. At first, it was just a passing glance, a meaningless detail in the sea of paperwork. But then a name leapt out at him, Evan Davis. Judge Carter sat back in his chair, frowning. It wasn't unusual for names to resurface in unrelated cases, but this felt different. He flipped the page, his pulse quickening. The log detailed the inventory of a police evidence locker, listing items confiscated during a separate robbery investigation that had taken place around the same time as the Lincoln Jewelers case. One item stood out, a gun. The description matched the weapon used in the robbery for which Evan had been convicted. The problem? This gun hadn't been submitted as evidence during Evan's trial. In fact, it hadn't been mentioned at all. Judge Carter leaned forward, the weight of his discovery pressing down on him. He cross-referenced the serial number with the trial documents, still fresh in his memory. It was an exact match, same make, same scratches on the barrel. But the report claimed this gun had been seized during an unrelated arrest 2 days after the robbery. How is that possible? He muttered under his breath, his heart racing as he pieced together the implications. If this gun had been in police custody, it couldn't have been used in the Lincoln Jewelers robbery. And if it wasn't the weapon, then whose fingerprints were on it? He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Judge Carter had spent decades navigating the labyrinth of the legal system, and he knew how easily critical details could be buried. But this wasn't a mistake. It felt intentional. Determined to get answers, he requested the full case file for the unrelated robbery. The next morning, a thick folder arrived, brimming with police reports, photographs, and witness statements. The deeper Judge Carter dug, the more the threads began to unravel. The arresting officer in the unrelated case was the same detective who had testified during Evan's trial. And then there was the anonymous tip, something he had barely considered during the trial, but now it seemed glaringly suspicious. Judge Carter requested a subpoena for the tip line records, his unease growing with every passing hour. When the documents finally arrived, his blood ran cold. The call hadn't come from a random citizen. It had originated from a burner phone registered under the same detective's name. The walls of his office seemed to close in as the realization hit him. Evan Davis had been set up. The evidence had been manipulated. The testimony orchestrated. Judge Carter's stomach churned as he thought about the 60-year sentence he had handed down, the shattered life of a young man who might have been innocent all along. Judge Carter had always prided himself on upholding the law, but now the law felt like quicksand beneath his feet. He knew what had to be done, but the path forward was fraught with peril. As the weight of his discoveries settled in, Judge Carter made a choice. He would dig deeper, no matter the cost. The truth demanded it, and he wasn't about to let it slip away. Judge Carter hadn't slept in days. His life had become a blur of legal documents, court transcripts, and scribbled notes scattered across his desk. What started as a routine investigation into the case of Evan Davis, a young man wrongfully convicted of a robbery he didn't commit, had grown into something far darker. The deeper Carter dug, the more he uncovered the twisted web of corruption that had led to Davis's wrongful conviction. It was more than just a mistake. It was a deliberate effort to cover up the truth. The first breakthrough came one cold evening when Carter met his old colleague, Daniel Hayes, a retired investigator with a reputation for cutting through layers of deception. They sat in a small, dimly lit diner off Highway 99, sipping coffee as Carter laid out his findings. Hayes leaned back in his chair, processing the information. "This isn't negligence, Robert," Hayes said, his voice steady but urgent. "If what you're saying is true, someone went to great lengths to make sure that kid took the fall." Carter nodded, his face tight with frustration. "I need proof, Dan. Solid proof." Hayes gave a sharp nod. "I'll help you get it, but we need to dig deeper." Within days, the two men were combing through police records, witness statements, and internal memos. What they uncovered was staggering. Falsified reports, missing evidence logs, and testimonies that had been altered to fit the prosecution's narrative. But it was one witness in particular who stood out, a store clerk who had originally identified another man as a suspect, but later changed his statement, implicating Evan Davis instead. Hayes tracked the man down to a small apartment on the outskirts of town. When they confronted him, the truth spilled out, and the clerk's hands shook as he confessed. "I didn't want to do it," he said, his voice trembling. "But Detective Lewis, he pressured me, said if I didn't, they'd arrest me for obstruction. I had no choice." The mention of Detective Lewis sent a jolt of anger through Carter. This was the same officer who the burner phone had been traced to. By this time, it was obvious that he had submitted a false tip, concealed evidence, and manipulated the case. Carter and Hayes knew they were onto something far bigger than they had imagined. As they dug further, they found a chilling pattern. Detective Lewis had a history of questionable tactics, intimidating witnesses, fabricating evidence, coercing confessions. Yet his record remained spotless, protected by a wall of bureaucratic red tape. Carter's blood boiled as he realized the extent of the corruption. He needed something concrete to bring the full scope of the crime to light. The breakthrough came when Hayes managed to recover deleted emails from Lewis's police account. One in particular stood out, a message sent to the district attorney, detailing a plan to ensure Evan Davis's conviction. Attached to the email was a list of fabricated evidence and doctored witness statements. Carter's hands clenched into fists as he read the damning message. The very system he had dedicated his career to was rotten to its core. There was no turning back now. Carter had the proof he needed, but exposing the truth wouldn't be easy. Detective Lewis had powerful allies in the department, and Carter knew going public could cost him everything, his career, his reputation, even his safety. But as Carter thought about Evan Davis sitting in a prison cell for a crime he didn't commit, the decision was clear. "We go public," Carter told Hayes one night, his voice resolute, "no matter what it takes." The next day, Carter filed a motion to reopen Evan Davis's case, attaching incriminating evidence against Detective Lewis. The courtroom buzzed with anticipation as the motion was filed. But Carter didn't stop there. He also filed a formal complaint with the Department of Justice, calling for an independent investigation into Lewis and the entire Fresno Police Department. The backlash was immediate. Anonymous threats started pouring in, warning Carter to back off. His colleagues distanced themselves from him, and the media turned their focus on his motives, questioning his integrity. But Carter stood firm. The truth was now out, and there was no turning back. But the storm was far from over. In the days following Carter's motion, the public's reaction was intense. Local headlines screamed of corruption within the Fresno Police Department, and outrage spread like wildfire. For the first time in decades, Carter felt the heat of scrutiny aimed directly at him. Some called him a hero. Others labeled him a traitor to the system he had sworn to uphold. But it wasn't just the public that turned against him. Carter's personal life began to feel the strain. He received phone calls at all hours, the line heavy with silence before abruptly going dead. One morning, he stepped outside to find his car tires slashed, a crude note scrawled on the windshield, "Drop it or else." Carter knew the risks of pursuing the truth, but the threats were escalating faster than he had anticipated. Still, he refused to be intimidated. He couldn't back down now. not when so many innocent lives had been destroyed by the very corruption he was exposing. Meanwhile, Detective Lewis wasn't about to go down without a fight. Through his attorney, Lewis denied all the allegations, claiming Carter's motion was a baseless attack on his character. "This is nothing more than a vendetta," Lewis declared in a televised interview, his polished demeanor carefully constructed, even as the walls closed in around him. Carter watched the interview from the comfort of his home, his jaw clenched in frustration. The lies were bold, calculated, and slick, but Carter had something Lewis didn't: the truth. As the investigation progressed, Hayes unearthed another critical piece of evidence: security camera footage from a parking lot near the jewelry store, recorded on the day of the robbery. The footage, which had somehow never been submitted during Evans' trial, showed a man matching Detective Lewis's description, leaving the scene with a duffel bag. Carter's heart raced as he watched the footage. This wasn't just exculpatory, it was damning. With this evidence, the pieces of the puzzle finally fell into place. The robbery had never been a random act of violence. It had been orchestrated by Detective Lewis himself. The next step was risky, but necessary. Carter called for an emergency hearing to present the new evidence. The courtroom was packed with reporters, activists, and Evans' family, all waiting to see how the judge would rule. Carter's hands trembled slightly as the footage played on a screen for the crowded gallery. Gasps rippled through the room as the realization sank in. "This man," Carter said, pointing at the screen, "is the same detective who led the investigation against Evan Davis. He manipulated the evidence, coerced witnesses, and framed an innocent man to cover his own tracks." The room was silent for a moment, the weight of the revelation sinking in. Then the flashes of cameras erupted, reporters scrambling to capture the moment. Detective Lewis, sitting in the gallery, looked pale but defiant. "You're making a mistake, Carter," he hissed as he was escorted out of the courtroom in handcuffs. "You don't know what you started." The confrontation left Carter shaken, but resolute. The case was now in the hands of a higher court, and Evan Davis's conviction would be re-examined. Carter knew that this was only the beginning. Weeks later, Judge Carter found himself once again seated in the same courtroom where Evan Davis had been sentenced. But this time, the atmosphere had shifted. The air felt charged with a sense of hope and reckoning. The gallery was overflowing. Reporters, activists, and Evan's family filled the benches, all waiting in hushed anticipation as the judge presiding over the retrial prepared to deliver the final decision. Evan, now thinner and showing the toll of his time behind bars, sat quietly at the defense table. His posture was composed, his eyes steady. Despite everything he had endured, he remained calm, resolute. From the back of the courtroom, Carter watched a young man who had become the center of a firestorm, who had suffered immensely for a crime he didn't commit. Carter felt a lump rise in his throat. The evidence he and Hayes had uncovered was undeniable. Surveillance footage, tampered reports, coerced testimonies. It all exposed a carefully constructed lie that condemned Evan while protecting the real perpetrators. Then, at last, came the moment. The presiding judge announced a decision to overturn Evan's conviction. The courtroom erupted. Applause, gasps, and sobs filled the room. Evan rose, his hands trembling as his mother rushed forward and wrapped him in an embrace that had waited years to happen. For a few precious seconds, it was as if time stood still. In that moment, Carter, still seated quietly in the back, allowed himself a rare, solemn smile. Justice had finally prevailed, but the road to this point had come at a steep cost. In the days that followed, the fallout spread rapidly. Detective Lewis, whose actions had fueled the wrongful conviction, was charged with multiple crimes. An independent investigation into the police department unearthed a long-standing culture of corruption that had flourished in silence. The case ignited nationwide outrage and calls for reform. Carter's unwavering stance became a rallying cry for those demanding accountability within the justice system. Despite the praise and public recognition, Carter remained reflective. He understood that this one victory, while monumental, was only a small part of a much larger battle. The justice system he had devoted his life to, the one he had once trusted blindly, was deeply flawed. But it wasn't beyond saving, and Carter was determined to use the rest of his career to help fix it. As for Evan, his journey was just beginning. Finally free of the weight of false conviction, he made a vow to dedicate his life to advocating for those still trapped in the same nightmare he had escaped. His story became a beacon, a symbol of resilience, justice, and the power of truth. The story of Evan Davis and Judge Carter stands as a powerful reminder. Justice is not automatic. It demands vigilance. It demands courage. And above all, it demands a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths, no matter the cost. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel.